Okay, so today we're diving into this Jordan Peterson thing.
Right.
Like, yeah, this YouTube clip where he talks about this intense period of transformation he went through. And like right off the bat, he mentions prison encounters, so you know it's got to be good.
Yeah, it's not your typical self-discovery journey, that's for sure.
Right. But it's not actually about like true crime or anything. It's more about this internal struggle he's going through. So like picture this. Peterson's in grad school, totally fascinated by psychology, but also like really wrestling with these big questions about good and evil, you know?
Yeah, the nature of man, all that.
Exactly. And to kind of grapple with all of this, he ends up going on this trip, well, not a trip, more like a field study, to a maximum security prison with his professor, who, by the way, sounds like a total character himself.
I'm picturing like Freud with a monocle.
Haha, all right.
Yeah.
Well, Peterson actually mentions he wore this 1890s Sherlock Holmes style cape to the prison. So, yeah, maybe even more eccentric than that.
Wow. Okay, there's layers to unpack there.
Totally. But I think it speaks to like how seriously he was taking this whole experience, you know? This wasn't just some casual field trip for him. It gets even wilder though. So he's face to face with these inmates, right? And he talks about meeting this one guy who seemed like totally normal. Peterson even says innocuous was the word that came to mind.
Innocuous. Wow.
Yeah, and then bam, he finds out this guy is a double murderer. Killed two police officers just like that. Peterson was completely taken aback, said he'd been expecting to meet some kind of monster, not this seemingly average person.
It's that banality of evil thing, right? It's often the people you least suspect who are capable of the most horrific acts.
Exactly. And this encounter really stuck with Peterson. Like, it kind of planted the seed for a lot of his later work on the shadow self, you know? The idea that we all have this potential for darkness within us, even if we don't want to admit it.
Right. It's not about condoning violence, but understanding that it exists as part of the human experience.
Yeah. And he has this other encounter at the prison that drives that point home even further. He hears about this inmate who brutally attacked another inmate, like really messed this guy up. And this time, Peterson's reaction is different. It's not just shock, it's more like this deep introspection.
This is where things start to get really interesting, right?
Yeah,
It shifts from observing others' capacity for darkness to examining his own.
exactly. He even talks about doing this mental exercise, almost like a meditation, where he forces himself to imagine if he could commit a similar act of violence. And it's not like he's trying to justify it or anything.
Right. It's more about confronting that uncomfortable truth, the idea that maybe under the right or wrong circumstances, any of us is capable of terrible things. It's like he's shining a light on that dark corner of human nature that we often try to ignore.
And it's like this prison visit kind of kicks off this whole internal exploration for Peterson. He starts talking about this weird split he notices within himself. Like he calls it the talker and the watcher, or sometimes the critic.
Oh, I've heard him talk about that.
Yeah, and the way he describes it, it's like so relatable, right? The talker is that part of us that's like always going on, you know, debating, forming opinions, just like spewing out words.
Right, like that constant internal monologue we all have
Yeah,
going on.
exactly. And then there's the watcher, this more detached part of us that's just observing the talker and like taking notes almost, and not always happy with what it sees either. Peterson actually quotes his watcher as saying things like, that isn't your idea, you don't really believe that, or you don't even know what you're talking about. It's brutal.
It's like that inner critic that can be so harsh sometimes,
Yeah.
but also maybe trying to steer us in the right direction, even if it doesn't always do it in the most delicate way.
Yeah, and I think that's what Peterson's getting at, right? He's not saying we should just like silence the talker completely, but he's definitely advocating for being more aware of it, like
Yeah.
noticing when it's just running on autopilot, spouting off dead wood, as he calls it.
Deadwood, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a pretty evocative image.
Right. And he says his watcher was basically like, dude, 95% of what you're saying is dead wood. It's all ego, no substance.
Ouch. That's got to be a tough pill to swallow.
Totally. But it's also kind of hilarious in a way, you
Yeah.
know? Like, can you imagine if we could all see that percentage for ourselves?
Right. Like how much of what we say is actually meaningful and how much is just like hot air. It's a humbling thought.
For sure. And I think that's part of why this whole concept resonated so much with me. It's like Peterson's giving us permission to be more discerning about our own thoughts and words, to actually question whether they're aligned with what we truly believe and value.
And that's really at the heart of his message here, isn't it? This idea of alignment.
Yes. He decides he's only going to speak when he feels like his words are like truly aligned with his internal state, with his values.
Which on the surface sounds like a pretty tall order, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you even begin to achieve that kind of alignment?
Exactly. And I'll admit, when I first heard him talk about it, I was like, okay, but how? But the more I think about it, the more I realize it's not about being perfect. It's about striving for that congruence between our inner and outer worlds, you know?
Right? Is that idea of walking the walk,
Yeah.
not just talking the talk.
Yes. And it reminded me of something else I'd read, actually. Carl Rogers, the
Yeah.
psychologist, he talked about this concept of congruence as well. Like that feeling of wholeness you get when your ideal self and your actual self are in sync.
It's a powerful idea,
Yeah.
and it speaks to that deep human need for authenticity, for living in a way that feels true to who we are at our core.
Exactly. And I think that's what Peterson's journey ultimately boils down to, this pursuit of authenticity, of aligning his words and actions with his deepest values, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. So we've covered a lot of ground here with Peterson, haven't we? From those intense prison encounters to like the inner workings of his own mind. It's been quite the journey.
It really makes you think, right? Like, how often do we actually stop and examine our own thoughts and motivations with that level of honesty?
Right. It's easy to go through life on autopilot, but Peterson's really challenging us to dig deeper, to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves, like that whole concept of the shadow self, for example. That's not exactly a comfortable thing to think about.
No, it's not. But I think that's also why it's so important, because if we can acknowledge those darker impulses within ourselves, if we can learn to integrate them into a more complete understanding of who we are, then maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to live more authentically, more peacefully even.
I like that. Finding a way to live more authentically. And that seems to be the common thread running through all of Peterson's work, right? Whether he's talking about psychology or philosophy or even like biblical stories, it always comes back to this idea of personal responsibility, of striving for a life that's aligned with our deepest values.
And that's not always easy. In fact, it's often really, really hard.
Yeah.
But the potential rewards, both for ourselves and for the world around us, they're immeasurable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Jordan Peterson's transformational journey, I'm curious to know, what's resonated with you most? What's that one takeaway you're going to carry with you?
For me, it's the reminder that true growth requires honesty, even when it's painful. It's about confronting our shadows, integrating those darker aspects of ourselves, and striving for that alignment between who we are on the inside and how we show up in the world.
It's a lifelong journey, that's for sure, but one worth taking. Well, folks, that's it for another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds open and keep exploring.